Picture in your head two games. They could be existing games or not, I'll leave that up to you. The first game is one that you consider bad, and I mean truly bad. It holds very few, if any, redeemable qualities. The art direction is flat and indistinct, the gameplay is dull, the story is nonsense, the characters are unlikable, and the music is bland. It's truly subpar in every way that counts. It's clear to you that this game wouldn't be good no matter who made it, because it's flawed at a fundamental level. The second game is quite different. It's actually decent. Not great, not terrible, but average, or very slightly above average. It has a lot of things going for it, but unfortunately, its best ideas aren't fully capitalized on. It's obvious that the foundation of the game is solid, but the developer lacks either the talent, the budget, or the time to realize the game's full potential, of which there is a ton. And this is clear to you the entire way through the game. So, which of these games is worse? Or rather, which is worse to play? Is the bad game the worst one because, well, in a practical sense, it's truly bad? Or is the decent game the worst one because of all the unrealized potential looming over the entire experience? Would you rather play a bad game that had no hope of being good at all, or an average game that could have been amazing if the developer simply had more experience or resources? Which is worse? No potential or wasted potential? This is a discussion I see periodically, and not even solely related to games. Of course, there's no correct answer, it all comes down to how practical or literal your feelings are on the matter. You may be the type to feel that bad is bad and average is average, regardless of potential, and that's all that really counts. And sometimes I feel that way too. But other times, it's easier to swallow a bad game when it showed little capability in being good to begin with. In that way, you can simply play it, express your distaste for it, and move on without any other feelings. It's ultimately a very shallow commitment, taking up no long-term space in your memory. In rare cases, there could be entertainment to be had incidentally if the game is bad enough. The classic, so bad it's good category. A particular type of badness where the game is so awful it loops back around to being fun. On the other side of the conversation, there's the games that could have been amazing, but sadly fall pretty short. They're still decent, but unfortunately they're full of unrealized potential, and that fact is something that can drag the entire experience down with constant reminders. Few things sour a game more than thinking, man, it would have been so much better if they had done this or that instead on a regular basis throughout the entire playthrough. Even though the game ends up being more enjoyable than an outright bad one, the untapped quality at every turn transforms the experience into a series of what-ifs. The game you played only served as a seed to plant in your head constant thoughts of the game that could have been, but wasn't made. This is why, to some people, playing a game with wasted potential is so much worse than playing a game with no potential at all. It's not about the quality you actually received, it's about the quality you could have received under better circumstances. Depending on your perspective, another difficult feeling to really process is when a game ends up being great, but is still disappointing, particularly due to one or two critical flaws. It's frustrating for a game to be within arm's reach of near perfection, only to fumble it at the very end. For example, I love Devil May Cry 4, particularly the special edition version, as it includes playable Virgil, Trish, and Lady, and has legendary Dark Knight mode, which was previously only in the PC version of the game. As much as I enjoy the combat, most of the boss fights, and all 5 playable characters, there is one massive flaw with the game, and that's the level design of the entire second half. Because, well, it doesn't really exist. If you never played the game, you probably don't know, but it was infamous for a while. Basically, the entire second half of the story, Dante's half, is all backtracking, and I mean that in the most literal way. The second half of the game is the first half, but backwards. Seriously. You even fight the same bosses as Nero does in the first half, except for the best boss in the game, Kratos. As much as I enjoy the game, the backtracking is such a massive blemish, stopping it from being probably the best entry in the series. It makes Dante's half of the game feel like it's not even his, like he's only there incidentally. It's still fun because it's Devil May Cry, but it feels like Dante is just going through Nero's levels, fighting Nero's enemies. It feels like none of this was meant for him. It's simultaneously frustrating that it ended up this way, and a relief that the rest of the game is still really fun. I think it's safe to assume that most, if not all of us, have experienced at least one game for each category. In some cases, one game might be both, and that's extra upsetting. After all, the entire reason we feel disappointed in something is because we had higher expectations than what we ended up getting. And it's easy to have high expectations when a game is from a developer you respect or is part of a series you consistently enjoy. Expectations are the root of disappointment and of surprise. But there's also the question of when disappointment is less because of the game being lower quality than anticipated, and more because of the individual's expectations simply not aligning with the experience the game wants to offer in the first place. I've read my fair share of reviews where the player in question expressed having a very specific picture of what they anticipate the game to be, only to be disappointed that the game is something different entirely, at a foundational level, and they consider this to be an inherent flaw. For example, I've seen someone play Yakuza 0 for the first time, as their first experience with the Yakuza or Like a Dragon series. They stated their disappointment in the game was because they expected it to be way more hard-boiled and subtle, as opposed to the melodramatic and sometimes outright goofy soap opera it actually is. For them, Yakuza 0 was disappointing because they expected it to present its content in a way that any fan would know not to expect. For people who love the franchise, the melodrama and silly substories are highlights of the experience, not detriments. It sort of comes off like a car reviewer criticizing a two-door pickup truck for not being a four-door coupe. It's unfortunate when this happens, and it often leads to talks about how reviews should cover the perspective of new players who don't know what to really expect. I do understand that train of thought, and agree to an extent. But if a reviewer completely misses the mark on what the very core of the game's intended experience is, and, this is the important detail, they consider this to be an inherent flaw on the game's part, then how can viewers trust them to not misinterpret or misrepresent everything else about it after the fact? While writing the script for this video, I saw some discussion on Twitter about consumers fighting back against reviewers and critics. And I think this frustration with misrepresenting the product is part of the issue. Some consumers do go overboard with it, taking even the tiniest criticism as a personal slight against their taste or their status as a fan. But I think there is a reason why this apprehension or agitation exists. It's easy for a big reviewer's expectations and disappointment to color the expectations their viewers have as well. And that can feel unfair to a game when that reviewer's expectations were totally in conflict with the game's goals and intentions from the get-go. It can make discourse surrounding the game very messy, because if the reviewer misrepresents the game, then now a bunch of other people who haven't played it are hearing and possibly accepting this misrepresentation as the experience most people will have. And this makes fans very, very frustrated. It's a poisoned well that they now feel like they have to purify, and sometimes that takes years. I know I'm kind of putting a target on my own back here because I also review games, but I try to minimize the potential for these mismatched expectations as much as I can, and keep an open mind as to what the game is. There are times when a game isn't what I expected, but I still ended up enjoying it, and that feels pretty nice. And while we're still on the subject of critical labels, I might as well touch on one more that isn't mentioned in the title of the video, and that word is overrated. It's a word I actively try to avoid using both in my videos and in everyday conversation. Over the years, I've grown a bit of a dislike for that word because it feels so abused, at least based on how I interpret it. For me, overrated is not so much a criticism of the product, but more a criticism of its reception. Sometimes the word of mouth you receive from others is the entire basis for your expectations of a game's quality. Unfortunately, that praise might not end up aligning with your own personal experience. For example, I played Deathloop as part of my 2021 catch-up at the beginning of 2022. Which is when I finally play through games I did not prioritize during the previous year so I can finalize my top 5 list. I was fully aware of the ridiculously positive reception Deathloop got immediately before and after it came out. Considering all that, I had high hopes for the game. I started it and played it anticipating that moment where it would become that 9 or 10 out of 10 experience that so many reviews said it was. But it never really came. I wouldn't say Deathloop is a bad game. For the most part, it accomplishes what it sets out to do. I just didn't receive an experience that I would say matches the acclaim I saw it receive. In that respect, I would consider Deathloop to be overrated. And that's not a judgment of the game, it's more a question of where those 9s and 10s came from to begin with. When I say it's overrated, I'm not simply questioning the quality of the game, I'm questioning the judgment of those reviews. In relation to all that, I mentioned earlier that it's possible for a game to be disappointing but still great, and the same is true here. A game can be overrated but still quite good. A game can receive those 9s and 10s, and while you wouldn't go that far, you still liked it a lot. Overrated doesn't have to be, nor should it be, a synonym for bad. I guess this is everything I have to say regarding bad versus disappointing and how expectations color our experience. My questions at the beginning of the video still stand. Is a decent game with unrealized potential worse than an outright bad game with no potential at all? Feel free to let me know how you personally feel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.